In 1847, Apache warrior Running Bear discovered something that should never have been found, a town that existed on no map, hidden in the maze of canyon walls where the Colorado Territory met the unknown. The people there lived by one unbreakable rule: no outsider could ever leave. When Running Bear tried to ride away at dawn, they stopped him with rifles and rope, their faces hollow with the kind of fear that comes from guarding terrible secrets. The town had ways of making people stay, ways that had nothing to do with walls or chains. For 20 years, the outside world assumed he was dead, another warrior lost to the endless conflicts of the frontier. Then one morning he walked out of those mountains alone. His face told a story that would haunt everyone who saw him. But what had that hidden town done to him during those 2 decades of captivity that changed him so completely? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of stolen horses across the broken landscape of what would one day be called Colorado Territory. Running Bear crouched beside a stream, studying hoofprints pressed deep into the muddy bank. 3 horses, shod in the white man's fashion, moving steadily northwest toward country that existed on no map his people had ever drawn. For 5 days he had followed this trail, leaving behind the familiar mesas and trading posts where his Apache band made their seasonal camps. The horses belonged to settlers, taken in a raid by Comanche warriors who had no understanding of the delicate balance his people maintained with the encroaching Americans. Such thefts brought soldiers, and soldiers brought death to Apache camps, where children played and elders told the old stories. His medicine pouch bounced against his chest as he remounted his paint horse, a steady rhythm that connected him to the spirit world his grandmother had taught him to honor. Inside the worn leather lay sacred items passed down through generations. An eagle feather blessed by the mountain spirits, red ochre mixed with his father's blood, and a small piece of turquoise that sang when the wind was right. The trail led deeper into country that felt wrong beneath his horse's hooves. The rocks here were older than memory, twisted into shapes that hurt the eyes to follow. No birds sang in the twisted pine trees that clung to cliff faces like desperate fingers. Even his horse began to step carefully, ears flicking forward and back, as if listening for sounds that didn't belong in the natural world. By midday, the trail had led him into a narrow canyon where shadows pooled thick as winter blood. The walls rose higher than a man could shoot an arrow, carved smooth by waters that no longer flowed. The silence pressed against his eardrums until he could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the stone. That was when he found the silver cross. It lay half buried in a pile of scree, the metal tarnished black except where recent handling had polished it bright. Spanish work, old enough to predate any mission he knew of in this territory. The cross bore markings he couldn't read, symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. When he picked it up, the metal felt warm despite the cool air, and for a moment he thought he heard voices speaking in a language that predated words. The horse prints continued deeper into the canyon, but now they were joined by other marks. Human footprints, bare and small, moving in a line as if following some invisible guide. The prints appeared fresh, made within the last day, but something about them troubled Running Bear in ways he couldn't name. They seemed too perfect, too evenly spaced, as if the people making them had forgotten how to walk naturally. The canyon curved sharply to the right, and when Running Bear rounded the bend, he stopped so suddenly that his horse snorted and danced sideways. Before him, impossibly, spread a town. It was built into the cliff face itself, stone buildings that seemed to grow from the living rock. Narrow streets wound between structures that defied understanding. Spanish colonial architecture, mixed with something older, something that predated the conquistadors by centuries. Wooden ladders connected different levels carved into the canyon wall, and everywhere he looked, people moved with the slow, careful steps of sleepwalkers. The stolen horses stood in a crude corral at the town's edge, but no one seemed to be guarding them. Indeed, no one seemed to have noticed Running Bear's arrival at all. The townspeople continued their activities, carrying water, tending small gardens, moving bundles from one building to another, but their faces held an emptiness that made his skin crawl. A woman looked up from where she was grinding corn, and Running Bear saw eyes that had forgotten how to hope. She was young, perhaps 20 summers, but her haste carried the weight of decades. When their gazes met, she opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it and returned to her work, with jerky, unnatural movements. The silence was complete, except for the soft sounds of daily life, the scrape of the grinding stone, the whisper of feet on stone paths, the distant bleat of goats. But underneath it all, Running Bear heard something else, a humming, almost below the threshold of hearing, that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. His horse refused to move forward, pawing the ground and rolling its eyes white. The animal's fear decided him. Running Bear dismounted and approached the town on foot, leading his horse and keeping one hand on the knife at his belt. The silver cross in his other hand grew warmer with each step, until it nearly burned his palm. As he entered the first street, heads turned to follow his progress. Not quickly, not with alarm, but with the slow, inevitable movement of flowers following the sun. Every face held the same expression of resigned desperation, as if his arrival was both hoped for and dreaded. Dawn came too quickly in the hidden town, painting the canyon walls with light that felt wrong somehow, too bright and too cold. Running Bear had spent the night in what the townspeople called a guest house, though no one had seemed particularly welcoming. They had simply pointed him toward a stone building and walked away, leaving him with questions that hung in the air like smoke. He had tried to leave twice during the night. Both times he found his path blocked by townspeople who appeared from nowhere, standing silent in the narrow streets until he turned back. They never spoke, never raised weapons, but their presence was as solid as the canyon walls themselves. Now, as the strange light crept across the stone buildings, Running Bear gathered his few possessions and walked toward his horse. The paint stood exactly where he had left it. But something was different. The animal's eyes held the same empty quality he had seen in the townspeople's faces, and when Running Bear approached, it didn't even lift its head. "You're leaving us so soon?" The voice came from behind him, and Running Bear turned to see a man emerging from the shadows between buildings. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in clothes that might once have been fine, but now looked worn to threads. His skin was pale as old bone, and his eyes held depth that made Running Bear think of winter caves where nothing lived. "I came for the horses," Running Bear said, keeping his voice steady. "I'll take them and go." The gaunt man smiled, but it was the kind of expression that belonged on a skull. "I'm afraid that's not possible. I am called the Keeper here, and I maintain certain traditions. Chief among them is that no outsider may leave our community." "Your community?" Running Bear looked around at the people moving through their morning routines with the same mechanical precision he had observed the night before. "These people are prisoners. We are all prisoners here, my friend. The difference is that some of us have learned to accept our circumstances." The Keeper stepped closer, and Running Bear caught a scent like old flowers and deeper earth. "You will learn as well in time." Running Bear's hand moved to his knife, but the Keeper raised one thin finger and shook his head. "Violence is discouraged. The town has ways of expressing its displeasure with those who break the peace." As if summoned by his words, people began emerging from buildings and side streets. They carried rifles and pistols, but also stranger weapons, tools that looked like they had been made for purposes Running Bear couldn't imagine. All of them moved with that same sleepwalker's precision, converging on the small courtyard where he stood with his horse. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing that you won't give willingly, eventually." The Keeper gestured toward a building carved deeper into the cliff face than the others. "We have prepared quarters for you, comfortable quarters, where you can rest and consider your situation. And if I refuse..." The Keeper's smile widened, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. Then we will help you understand the alternatives." The townspeople closed in, not threatening but implacable, like a slow tide that would eventually cover everything in its path. Running Bear counted at least 20 of them, men and women of various ages, all wearing the same expression of resigned desperation he had noticed before. Whatever had been done to them, whatever kept them here, had stolen something essential from their spirits. His horse made no sound when they led it away. It simply followed the woman who took its reins, moving with the same mechanical obedience that seemed to infect everything in this place. Running Bear watched it go and felt something cold settle in his chest. The quarters they provided were indeed comfortable, a stone room with a bed, a small table, and a window that looked out over the strange town. The window had no glass, but when Running Bear approached it, he felt an invisible barrier that repelled his touch, like opposite ends of powerful magnets. The keeper stood in the doorway, watching with those winter-deep eyes. "You'll find that resistance only makes things more difficult. The town has been here for centuries, and it has ways of dealing with those who refuse to accept their place." From his belt, the keeper produced a set of iron shackles, unlike anything Running Bear had ever seen. The metal was black as a moonless night, and symbols were carved into the surface, symbols that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. When the keeper fastened them around Running Bear's wrists, the warrior felt his strength begin to drain away like water from a broken pot. "These will help you understand," the keeper said softly. "Understanding is the first step toward acceptance." The shackles were not heavy, but they carried a weight that went beyond iron. They pulled at something deeper than muscle and bone, something connected to the part of him that knew how to hunt and fight and survive. With each breath, Running Bear felt a little more of himself disappearing into the hungry metal. "What is this place?" he managed to ask. The keeper paused in the doorway, his pale face almost luminous in the strange light. "Home," he said simply. "For as long as you have left to live." The keeper returned on the third day, carrying a leather-bound book that looked older than the stones of the canyon itself. The covers were worn smooth by countless hands, and the pages within whispered against each other like dried leaves when he opened it. Running Bear could see writing on the yellowed paper, but the words seemed to shift and change when he tried to focus on them. "The Chronicle of Sorrows," the keeper said, settling into the room's single chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones had forgotten how to bend properly. "Every name is recorded here, every soul who has found their way to our community and chosen to stay." "Chosen," Running Bear repeated, rattling the iron shackles that had grown heavier with each passing hour. The strange symbols carved into the metal seemed to pulse with their own dim light, and he could feel them drawing something vital from his body with each heartbeat. "Oh yes, they all choose eventually. Some take longer than others, but the town is patient. It has all the time in the world." The keeper's pale fingers traced down a page covered in names written in different hands, different languages. "Would you like to know how it began?" Running Bear said nothing, but the keeper continued as if he had asked. 1530, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado's expedition, searching for the 7 cities of gold. One of his lieutenants, Diego Mendoza, found something in these canyons that was worth more than all the gold in the Americas. A place where death had no power, where a man could live forever if he was willing to pay the price. The keeper turned several pages, revealing crude drawings that hurt to look at directly. Figures in Spanish armor knelt before something that writhed and coiled in dimensions that shouldn't exist. Above them, symbols hung in the air like frozen fire. Mendoza was a practical man. He saw opportunity where others saw horror. The entity he found here was ancient beyond human understanding, but it was also hungry, always hungry. It had been sleeping in the deep places beneath the canyon for thousands of years, waiting for someone clever enough to make a bargain. What kind of bargain? The keeper's smile was like watching winter settle over a graveyard. Food for protection. The entity would ensure that those who served it lived forever, never aging, never dying. In return, they would help it feed. Feed on what? Life, hope. The part of a person that believes escape is possible. The keeper closed the book with a sound like bones breaking. The Spanish built this town as bait, you see. A refuge that appeared on no map, a sanctuary hidden from the world. Travelers would find it when they were lost, desperate, grateful for shelter and safety. Running Bear felt the pieces beginning to fit together in ways that made his stomach clench. And once they were here, they could never leave. Oh, they tried at first. They all try, but the entity feeds on those attempts, grows stronger with each failure. And those who serve it, well, we learned long ago that cooperation brings certain rewards. The keeper stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the town where people moved through their daily routines with the precision of carved figures on a mechanical clock. I was a conquistador once, you know. Diego's second in command. I remember the taste of wine, the warmth of Spanish sunshine, the sound of my wife's laughter. That was 400 years ago. 400 years. The number settled in Running Bear's mind like a stone dropping into still water. The keeper's pale skin, his two white teeth, the way he moved as if his bones were held together by habit rather than sinew. Suddenly it all made terrible sense. The entity doesn't grant true immortality, the keeper continued. It simply delays the final accounting. We age, but slowly. We die, but never completely. The part of us that should move on to whatever comes next remains trapped here, serving its hunger. And the others? The townspeople. Some are like me, servants who have been here since the beginning. Others are travelers who found this place over the centuries and were integrated into the community. They all chose to stay. Eventually, the alternative is much worse than simple death. The keeper turned back to Running Bear, and in his winter-deep eyes was something that might once have been pity. The entity is curious about you, Apache. Your spirit burns differently than most, brighter. It will enjoy testing how long that light takes to dim. From somewhere deep beneath the town came a sound like wind through a vast cave, but Running Bear could feel it in his bones rather than hear it with his ears. The iron shackles grew suddenly cold against his wrists, and the symbols carved into them flared with hungry light. It knows you're here now, the keeper said softly. It's been waiting to meet you properly. Tonight, when the moon is dark, you'll have that honor. He moved toward the door, then paused. I suggest you use the remaining daylight to make peace with your gods, Apache. After tonight, you'll have no need of them. The door closed with a sound like a tomb ceiling, leaving Running Bear alone with the weight of 4 centuries pressing down on him like the stone of the canyon itself. The moon's absence brought no darkness to the hidden town. Instead, a phosphorescent glow emanated from the canyon walls themselves, as if the stone had absorbed centuries of unnatural light and was now bleeding it back into the air. Running Bear sat in his cell, feeling the iron shackles pulse against his wrists in rhythm with that eerie illumination. His medicine pouch lay on the small table, where the keeper had placed it after the night's introduction to the entity. Running Bear stared at the worn leather, afraid to touch it during those terrible hours in the chamber beneath the town. He had felt something fundamental change in the sacred objects his grandmother had blessed. The eagle feather that once sang with wind spirit voices now whispered with darker tongues. The turquoise that had always felt warm in his palm was cold as winter stone. Even the red ochre mixed with his father's blood seemed different, darker somehow, as if the entity's attention had stained it with intentions that predated human understanding. But Running Bear was Apache. His people had survived by adapting to hostile territory, by finding water in the desert and shelter in the storm. If this place wanted to change him, it would have to work harder than it expected. He began with small acts of resistance. When the townspeople brought food, he ate only what he needed to maintain strength, leaving the rest untouched. When they spoke to him in their hollow voices, he responded in Apache, forcing them to acknowledge that he remained connected to something beyond their cursed community. Most importantly, he began to map the rhythms of his imprisonment. The shackles grew heavier during certain hours, lighter during others. The entity's attention seemed to ebb and flow like a tide, strongest when the moon was dark, weaker when sunlight penetrated the deepest parts of the canyon. And the townspeople themselves moved differently at various times, sometimes almost human in their gestures, other times puppet-like in their mechanical precision. On the seventh day, a woman brought his evening meal. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and eyes that held more awareness than most of the others. When she set down the wooden bowl, their fingers brushed, and Running Bear felt something like an electric shock pass between them. "Maria," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. "My name was Maria." Was, not is, as if her name, like everything else in this place, belonged to someone she used to be. "How long?" he asked, matching her whisper. 43 years. Came here as a child with my family, Mexican settlers, fleeing Apache raids." She glanced toward the door, fear flickering across her features. "They're all dead now. All except me, the entity. It kept me for later. Later, it feeds differently on children. Has to wait for us to ripen, like fruit on a tree." Maria's voice carried a bitterness that ran deeper than the canyon walls. "I've been ripening for 4 decades. That night, after the phosphorescent glow had settled into its deepest phase, Maria returned. She moved with the same mechanical precision as the others, but when she reached Running Bear's cell, her movements became more fluid, more human. "It sleeps now," she said, producing a small key from her dress. "Not truly sleeps, but rests. Digests what it consumed today." She unlocked his shackles, and Running Bear felt strength flow back into his limbs like water into a dry riverbed. The relief was so intense he almost cried out. "We have perhaps an hour before it notices," Maria said. "Long enough for you to understand what you're truly facing." She led him through corridors he hadn't seen before, deeper into the cliff-carved structure. The walls here were older than the Spanish buildings above, covered with symbols that predated any human civilization. The air grew thick and oppressive, filled with whispers in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. "This is where it sleeps," Maria said, stopping before a chamber that seemed to extend infinitely into the rock. "And this is where those who resist too strongly are taken for final processing." In the chamber's depths, Running Bear saw movement, shapes that might once have been human, writhing in configurations that hurt to perceive. Their mouths opened and closed in silent screams that seemed to echo in dimensions beyond sound. "That's what happens to those who never learn to serve," Maria whispered. "They become part of it, but retain just enough consciousness to understand what they've lost." She showed him other things during that stolen hour. Hidden passages that the entity either couldn't perceive or chose to ignore. Chambers where previous resistors had left messages scratched into stone. Warnings and maps and desperate plans that had all ultimately failed. "Why are you showing me this?" Running Bear asked as they made their way back to his cell. "Because you're different," Maria said. "Your spirit burns in ways the entity hasn't encountered before. Apache medicine works by different rules than the magic that binds this place." She locked the shackles back around his wrists, but not before pressing something into his palm, a small object wrapped in cloth, warm from her body heat. "Keep this hidden. It's all that remains of my father's courage. Maybe it will serve you better than it served him." After she left, Running Bear unwrapped the object carefully. It was a piece of obsidian napped into the shape of an arrowhead, but polished to mirror brightness. When he looked into its surface, he saw not his own reflection, but glimpses of things that were, things that might be, and things that should never exist at all. The medicine pouch on his table seemed to pulse with renewed warmth, as if Maria's gift had awakened something that the entity's corruption couldn't quite reach. For the first time since his capture, Running Bear allowed himself to hope. The obsidian mirror showed Running Bear truths that made his soul recoil. In its polished surface, he watched the entity's true form writhe in the deep chambers beneath the town, a thing of hunger and shadow that had no shape the human mind could properly grasp. It was old beyond measure, a remnant from when the world was young and different laws governed reality. He saw the original bargain, played out in the mirror's dark reflection, Diego Mendoza, kneeling before the hungry darkness, offering his men's lives in exchange for immortality. The Spanish soldiers screaming as their essence was drained to feed something that should never have awakened. And underneath it all, the entity's patient satisfaction as it realized humans would do its hunting for it. But the mirror showed him other things as well. Moments when the entity's attention wavered, when its control over the town loosened like a grip going slack. These lapses were brief and followed no pattern he could discern, but they were real. In those stolen seconds, some townspeople remembered who they had been before the hunger claimed them. Maria visited him again 3 nights later, moving with the same careful stealth that had marked their first clandestine meeting. This time, she brought others, a man who had been a trader from Santa Fe, captured 20 years ago, and an elderly woman whose family had sought shelter in the town during a blizzard in 1823. Thomas, the man whispered, introducing himself. I remember trading posts and the smell of coffee brewing at dawn. Sometimes I can almost taste it. Sarah, the woman added, her voice carrying the weight of decades. I used to bake bread that made my children laugh with joy. The entity feeds on such memories, but it cannot take them all at once. Some remain hidden in the deep places of the heart. They spoke in hushed tones about the nature of their prison. The entity required their cooperation to maintain the town's existence in this reality. Without willing servants, the bargain that bound it to this place would weaken. But true resistance was nearly impossible. The hunger was patient and thorough, wearing down even the strongest spirits over time. Others have tried to organize escapes, Thomas, groups of 10, 20, sometimes more. All failed. The entity grows stronger with each attempt, feeds on the hope that drives them. What made their attempts fail? Running Bear asked. Sarah's ancient eyes grew distant. They tried to flee during the wrong times, when its attention was strongest. They used brute force against something that existed partially outside physical reality. And they always tried to take heaven at once. The entity punishes the community for individual acts of rebellion, Maria explained. Those who resist watch their friends suffer until they surrender. Collective action seems like mercy, but it only provides a larger feast. Running Bear studied the obsidian mirror in his palm, watching shadows move in its depths. What if someone could weaken it first, make it hungry enough to be vulnerable? Impossible, Thomas said immediately. It's always hungry. That's its nature. But Sarah leaned forward, her eyes sharp, despite their age. Not always. I've been here longer than most, and I've seen patterns during certain celestial alignments, when the barriers between worlds grow thin. It must focus its attention on maintaining its grip on this reality. Those are the times when its hold on us weakens. How often? Every 20 years, when the stars align in the configuration the Spanish called La Puerta Oscura, the dark door. The next such alignment. Sarah paused, calculating. 18 years from now. 18 years. The number settled in Running Bear's mind like a stone. 18 years of pretending to submit while maintaining the core of his identity. 18 years of gathering allies and learning the entity's weaknesses. 18 years of waiting for a single night when the hungry darkness might be vulnerable. The mirror shows me something else, he said carefully. The entity feeds on despair, but certain kinds of spiritual energy burn it like acid. Medicine power worked according to the old ways. Maria looked skeptical. Many have tried prayer and ritual. None succeeded. Not prayer, not the white man's religion, or even the Spanish god that built this trap. Running Bear's fingers tightened around the obsidian. Apache medicine, earth magic, worked with the kind of patience that turns stone to sand. He told them about the vision the mirror had shown him, a way to poison the entity's food, to corrupt the despair it consumed with something harder and more bitter. Not hope, which it could digest easily, but the kind of stubborn endurance that refused to be broken even when breaking would bring relief. You're talking about surviving 18 years of this while keeping your spirit intact, Thomas said. The hunger is patient. It will wear you down, make you forget who you were, make you grateful for the smallest mercies. Then I'll have to remember harder than it can make me forget. That night, after the others had gone, Running Bear sat with the obsidian mirror and began the first of what would become nightly rituals. He called up memories of his grandmother's teaching, of the smell of sage smoke and the sound of sacred songs echoing off canyon walls. He remembered the taste of water from hidden springs and the feeling of wind through eagle feathers. Most importantly, he remembered his name. Not just the white man's translation Running Bear, but his true name, the one given to him in the old language by the medicine man who had seen his spirit's shape in a vision quest fire. That name was power, and power was what he would need to survive what was coming. The entity stirred in its deep chambers, sensing the change in one of its prisoners, but Running Bear kept his thoughts small and hidden, letting the hunger see only surface despair while protecting the ember of defiance that burned in his heart's deepest chamber. 18 years. He would make them count. The change in Running Bear's behavior was subtle but deliberate. Where once he had raged against his captivity, now he sat quietly in his cell, appearing to contemplate his circumstances with the resignation the keeper had predicted. When townspeople brought food, he thanked them politely. When the keeper visited to check on his progress, Running Bear asked questions about the town's history with what seemed like genuine curiosity. "I see you're beginning to understand," the keeper said during one such visit, his pale features showing something that might have been satisfaction. "Resistance only brings suffering. Acceptance brings accommodation." Running Bear nodded slowly, letting his shoulders slump in apparent defeat. "The iron grows heavy when I fight it, lighter when I do not." "Precisely. The shackles respond to your spiritual state. Submit completely, and they become as light as feathers. Continue to harbor thoughts of escape, and they will drag you down until walking becomes impossible." It was useful information, delivered with the keeper's typical arrogance. Running Bear filed it away with the dozens of other details he had been collecting. The entity's servants believed their own performance, mistaking his strategic patience for genuine surrender. In truth, the shackles had grown lighter, but not because his spirit was breaking. Instead, he had learned to shield his deepest thoughts behind layers of meditation his grandmother had taught him. The iron could sense surface emotions, but struggled to penetrate the protected spaces where Apache medicine workers stored their most sacred knowledge. Each night, when the phosphorescent glow settled into its deepest phase, Running Bear practiced the mental disciplines that would keep him sane through the long years ahead. He built memory palaces in his mind, carefully cataloging everything he observed about the town's routines, the entity's behavior, the weaknesses of its servants. The sacred eagle feather from his medicine pouch had begun to sing again, though its voice was different now. Stronger in some ways, as if exposure to the entity's corruption had taught it new songs of resistance. When he held it during his meditations, Running Bear could feel his connection to the world beyond the canyon walls, to the spirits of wind and stone that remembered when this land was clean. 3 months into his captivity, the townspeople began treating him as if he belonged. They assigned him small tasks, helping to maintain the water systems carved into the cliff face, assisting with the community gardens that somehow flourished in soil that should have been lifeless. Running Bear performed these duties with apparent acceptance while memorizing every detail of the town's infrastructure. The water came from deep springs that connected to underground rivers. The gardens were fed by a complex irrigation system that had been improved over centuries of occupation. Most importantly, he discovered that certain areas of the town were off-limits to regular inhabitants, chambers and passages that only the keeper and his most trusted servants could enter. "You adapt well," Maria observed during one of their carefully arranged encounters. She spoke aloud now, no longer needing to whisper, as Running Bear's apparent submission had earned him small freedoms. "Apache survive by understanding their environment," he replied, measuring his words carefully. "This place has its own ecosystem, better to learn its ways than fight what cannot be changed." But when their eyes met, she saw the truth he couldn't speak. The ember still burned in the protected depths of his spirit, carefully shielded, but growing stronger with each passing day. His submission was performance, his acceptance a mask worn to gain the time and position he would need when the moment came. The keeper began including him in certain community activities, evening gatherings where the townspeople shared stories and songs with the mechanical enthusiasm of wind-up toys. During these sessions, Running Bear listened carefully to the older residents' accounts of life before their capture. Hidden in their hollow recitations were fragments of valuable information about the outside world's development, the movement of armies and settlers, the changing nature of the frontier. More importantly, he began to understand the psychological architecture of the town's control system. The entity didn't simply drain its prisoners' life force, it rewarded cooperation with small comforts, tiny freedoms that made captivity seem more bearable. Those who served longest gained status within the community hierarchy, becoming invested in maintaining the system that oppressed them. It was brilliant in its cruelty, turning victims into accomplices by giving them just enough agency to feel responsible for their own imprisonment. But Running Bear had spent his youth learning to track prey across landscapes that would kill the unprepared. Patience was not just a virtue among his people, it was a survival skill. He could wait, watch and plan, while his captors convinced themselves they had broken him. The sacred feather pulsed against his chest during his nightly meditations, its song growing clearer as the months passed. Through it he maintained contact with the spirits of his ancestors, drawing strength from traditions that predated the entity's hunger by thousands of years. In the deepest part of his protected mind, Running Bear began building something the creature beneath the town could not detect or understand, a weapon forged from patience, memory, and the unbreakable determination of a people who had never learned to surrender. The bone whistle found its way to Running Bear through a chain of careful hands that spoke of organization hidden beneath the town's mechanical surface. It arrived wrapped in a scrap of cloth, tucked inside his evening meal, small enough to be mistaken for a fragment of gristle if discovered by the wrong eyes. Maria had carved it from what she claimed was her father's rib bone, taken during the family's integration into the community 43 years earlier. The surface was yellowed with age and marked with symbols that predated both Spanish and Apache traditions. When Running Bear put it to his lips and blew softly, it produced no sound. His ears could detect, but something deeper responded, a vibration that seemed to resonate through stone and shadow. 3 short pulses, then 2 long ones. The pattern Maria had taught him for safe to meet. Within minutes the response came from somewhere in the maze of chambers carved into the cliff face, 4 quick pulses that meant understood. The whistle connected him to a network of resistance that had been building for decades in the spaces between the entity's attention. Not everyone in the town was broken beyond repair. Some, like Maria, had learned to hide their true selves so deeply that even the hunger couldn't reach them. Others retained fragments of memory strong enough to fuel hope, however small and carefully protected. Thomas, the trader from Santa Fe, had been gathering information about guard rotations and the schedules that governed the town's daily activities. Sarah, the baker whose children had died in the entity's service, mapped the underground passages that connected different sections of the cliff-carved structure. Even some of the Spanish servants, those who had served the entity for centuries, occasionally showed cracks in their absolute loyalty. "We number 23, Maria told him during a meeting in one of the forgotten storage chambers. "Not counting you, some are stronger than others, but all retain enough of themselves to remember what freedom felt like." 23 souls out of nearly 200 townspeople. It seemed impossibly small, but Running Bear had learned that warfare was often won by determined minorities who understood the stakes better than their enemies. The whistle network allows us to coordinate without gathering in groups large enough to attract attention, Thomas explained. Messages pass from person to person through normal daily interactions to outside observers. We're simply going about our assigned tasks. The communication system was elegant in its simplicity. Different whistle patterns conveyed basic concepts: danger, safety, meeting requests, information sharing. More complex messages were encoded in seemingly casual conversations. hidden in references to weather patterns or memories of the outside world. Running Bear contributed his own knowledge to the network. His Apache training had taught him to observe details others missed. The way certain stones in the walls were newer than others, suggesting hidden passages, or how the entity's attention seemed to focus more intensely on some areas of the town during specific times of day. Most importantly, he shared what the obsidian mirror had revealed about the celestial alignment. Still 17 years away, the knowledge spread through the Whistle network, like water soaking into dry earth, giving the resistance something concrete to plan toward. 17 years feels like forever, admitted a woman named Catherine, who had been captured during a wagon train raid in 1834. How do we maintain hope that long, by building something the entity cannot destroy? Running Bear answered, not hope, purpose. Hope can be eaten, but purpose grows stronger when it's tested. He began teaching them techniques his grandmother had passed down, mental disciplines for protecting sacred knowledge, ways to shield their deepest thoughts from supernatural intrusion, methods for drawing strength from memory and tradition, rather than circumstance. The sessions happened during normal work details, disguised as casual conversation while they tended the gardens or maintained the water systems. Running Bear would share a fragment of Apache wisdom while harvesting vegetables or demonstrate a meditation technique while cleaning tools. To the keeper's servants, it looked like natural social interaction among the community's newer members. But beneath the surface, the resistance was learning to think like warriors again. They practiced moving through the town without attracting attention, memorized the locations of potential weapons and escape routes, and most importantly began to see themselves as fighters rather than victims. The bone whistle became the symbol of their hidden network, a reminder that even in this place of despair, communication and coordination were possible. When its soft vibrations carried through the stone passages, 23 trapped souls remembered that they were not truly alone. The entity noticed the change eventually, as such things always do. Its servants reported that some townspeople seemed more animated lately, more engaged with their daily tasks. But this appeared to be a positive development, evidence that the community's newest members were settling into their roles with healthy enthusiasm. The keeper himself commented favorably on the improved morale during one of his regular inspections. Integration proceeds well, he told Running Bear. You've been a positive influence on the others. The community benefits when new arrivals demonstrate proper acceptance of their circumstance. Running Bear nodded respectfully, while in his mind the sacred eagle feather sang with quiet satisfaction. The entity's greatest weakness was also its greatest strength, the assumption that all resistance could be detected and consumed. The Apache warriors had spent generations learning to hide from enemies who possessed superior numbers and weapons. The town might be a trap, but every trap had mechanisms that could be understood, manipulated, and eventually turned against the one who set it. The bloodstone arrived without warning, pressed into Running Bear's palm during what seemed like an accidental brush of contact in the town's central courtyard. The woman who passed it to him, one of the keeper's most trusted servants, moved on without acknowledgement, but her eyes held a flicker of awareness that hadn't been there before. Stone was small, no larger than a child's thumb, and appeared to be made from deep red jasper. But when Running Bear examined it more closely in the privacy of his chamber, he realized it was something far more unsettling. The red wasn't pigment or natural coloration. It was actual blood, somehow preserved within the crystal matrix, and still liquid despite being centuries old. When he held the stone, it remained cool and inert. But during his evening meditation, as he touched the sacred eagle feather and opened his spirit to the deeper currents that flowed beneath reality, the bloodstone began to glow with a pulsing crimson light. The rhythm matched his heartbeat at first, then gradually synchronized with something else, something vast and patient that breathed in cycles measured by decades rather than seconds. The entity's attention, made visible through the strange artifact. Maria found him the next morning sitting perfectly still with the glowing stone in his open palm. Her face went pale when she saw it, and she quickly checked the corridor before closing the door behind her.
"Where did you get that?"
she whispered. Elena Mendoza gave it to me yesterday. Diego's descendant, one of the original Spanish families. Elena hasn't spoken to anyone outside the Keeper's inner circle for 20 years. If she gave you the bloodstone— Maria's voice trailed off as she considered the implications. The entity is taking a personal interest in you. The stone pulsed brighter, as if responding to their conversation, its red glow casting strange shadows on the chamber walls. Running Bear could feel something pressing against the edges of his consciousness. Not thoughts exactly, but intentions that carried the weight of geological time. It's trying to communicate, he said, to understand why its usual methods aren't working on me. This is dangerous. When it focuses this much attention on a single prisoner, things tend to end badly. Maria's hands shook as she spoke. The last person who received the bloodstone was a Franciscan priest in 7. They found him 3 days later, still alive but changed. He could speak only in languages that didn't exist, and his eyes showed visions of things that shouldn't be seen by mortal mind. But Running Bear had spent years preparing for this moment. The mental disciplines his grandmother had taught him weren't just for preserving memory, they were weapons designed to protect the soul from supernatural intrusion. When the entity's attention pressed against his mind like a vast, patient finger, he was ready. Instead of resisting directly, which would only provoke stronger assault, he guided the probing consciousness through carefully prepared layers of his psyche. Surface thoughts about his supposed acceptance of captivity, deeper concerns about adapting to life in the town. And beneath those, protected by generations of Apache spiritual training, the true core of his resistance lay hidden and patient. The entity found what it expected to find, a spirit gradually breaking under the weight of hopeless circumstances. It tasted his surface despair and found it satisfying, rich with the kind of slow-burning anguish that provided the most nourishing sustenance. But it couldn't reach the deeper places where his grandmother's teachings had built walls of memory and tradition stronger than stone. Night after night, the bloodstone pulsed as the entity conducted its psychological excavation. Running Bear endured visions meant to break his will, images of his family dying slowly while calling his name, scenes of Apache bands being slaughtered because he wasn't there to warn them of approaching soldiers, phantoms of the life he could have lived if he had never entered the cursed canyon. Each assault was more sophisticated than the last, targeted specifically at the guilt and regret that Apache warriors were trained to carry. The entity had learned much about human psychology during its centuries of feeding, and it applied that knowledge with surgical precision. But Running Bear had advantages the creature didn't understand. Apache culture prepared its warriors for exactly this kind of spiritual warfare. His people had always known that the deepest battles were fought in the spaces between heartbeats, where courage was measured not by the absence of fear but by the ability to act despite it. The sacred eagle feather sang with increasing vigor as the entity's attacks continued. Each failed assault seemed to strengthen rather than weaken Running Bear's connection to his ancestral spirits. The feather's song carried voices of warriors who had faced their own impossible odds and survived through stubbornness rather than strength. Thomas noticed the change during one of their carefully arranged meetings. "You look different," he said. "Older, but also harder somehow." "The entity is trying to understand what makes me different from its other prisoners," Running Bear explained. "Each time it fails to break me, it learns something new about Apache's spiritual defenses. But I'm learning about it as well." The bloodstone had become a window that worked both ways. While the entity studied him, Running Bear observed its true nature with increasing clarity. He saw how it fed, how it thought, and most importantly, how it could be wounded. The war club had been his grandfather's, carved from ironwood that had grown in sacred groves and blessed by medicine men, whose names were remembered in the songs of wind through canyon walls. Running Bear had carried it into battle against Comanche raiders, Mexican soldiers, and American cavalry. It had never failed him, never broken under the stress of combat, never let him down when death walked close beside him. Until now, The crack appeared during his 13th year of captivity, a hairline fracture that split the wood along its grain like a wound that wouldn't heal. Running Bear discovered it during his morning ritual, when he touched each of his remaining possessions to maintain connection with the world beyond the cursed town. The sacred eagle feather still sang with power, though its song had grown more complex over the year. The obsidian mirror continued to show visions of truth, revealing the entity's movements and the resistance network's careful progress. Even his medicine pouch retained most of its protective properties, shielding his deepest thoughts from supernatural intrusion. But the war club was dying. Maria found him sitting in his chamber, holding the fractured weapon across his knees like a wounded child. She had aged during their shared captivity, though not in the normal way. The entity's influence preserved the body while slowly consuming the spirit, leaving her looking like a woman suspended between youth and old age. "How long has it been like this?" she asked, settling beside him with the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it truly mattered. 3 days, maybe 4. Running Bear's voice carried a weight that hadn't been there even during the entity's most vicious psychic assaults. "It's dying because I'm dying. You're stronger than you've ever been. The bloodstone attacks barely touch you anymore. Physically, yes, but something else is breaking down." He traced the crack with one finger, feeling how it had deepened since yesterday. "Apache warriors aren't meant to live in cages, even comfortable ones. We're meant to move, to hunt, to protect our people. 13 years of pretending to be tame is killing something in me that resurrection can't restore." The admission hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. For 13 years, Running Bear had maintained perfect discipline, hiding his true nature behind layers of apparent submission, while building the resistance network and gathering intelligence about their supernatural prison. But the cost of that deception was becoming impossible to ignore. "The entity offers me things now," he continued. "Small freedoms, minor responsibilities, the chance to become one of the Keeper's trusted servants. And the terrible thing is, sometimes I consider accepting." Maria's hand tightened on his arm. "That's not weakness. That's what this place does to everyone, eventually. The hunger doesn't just feed on despair. It cultivates it, nurtures it, makes it seem like the only rational response to an impossible situation. My grandfather told me that a warrior's weapons reflect his spirit. When they break, it means he's lost something that can't be replaced." Running Bear held up the war club, and the crack seemed to pulse with its own dark light. "What happens to the resistance if I break completely? The same thing that would happen if you had never come here. We survive, we adapt, we wait for our moment." Maria's voice carried the kind of steady determination that had kept her alive for 4 decades in hell. "But you're not breaking, Running Bear. You're changing. Into what? Something this place has never encountered before. An Apache warrior who learned its secrets from the inside, who built alliances among its prisoners, who taught us to think like fighters instead of victims." She gestured toward the window, where other resistance members moved through their daily routines with purpose, rather than mechanical obedience. "Look what you've created. 23 souls who remember their names, who communicate through the whistle network, who practice the mental disciplines you taught them." But Running Bear could see deeper than surface improvement. The bloodstone still pulsed against his chest, its rhythm synchronized with the entity's attention, and through that connection, he felt the creature's patient satisfaction. It knew about the resistance network. It had always known. The small freedoms, the apparent success of their hidden organization, the gradual improvements in morale, all of it was carefully orchestrated. They weren't building toward escape. They were being fattened for a larger feeding. "It's been playing with us," he said quietly, "letting us think we're making progress while it prepares something worse." The war club split completely as he spoke, the 2 halves falling to the floor with sounds like breaking bones. The fracture revealed wood that had gone black at its core, infected by something that transformed sacred ironwood into material that felt wrong to touch. "How long have you known?" Maria asked. "Suspected for months. Confirmed today." Running Bear gestured at the broken weapon. "The entity doesn't just feed on despair. It feeds on hope as well. False hope is more nourishing than simple surrender, because it contains the energy of planned action. We've been providing it with a feast for 13 years. The implications settled between them like stones falling into dark water. Every whistle message, every clandestine meeting, every small victory they had celebrated, all of it had been observed, catalogued, and ultimately consumed by the hungry darkness beneath the town. Then what do we do? Running Bear looked at the broken pieces of his grandfather's war club, seeing in them the remains of the man he had been before entering this place. That warrior was dead, his weapons shattered, his certainties turned to dust. But something new was emerging from the wreckage, something the entity hadn't planned for and couldn't control. "We stopped feeding it," he said. "We stopped playing by its rules entirely." The conquistador's helmet lay buried beneath layers of rubble in a chamber so deep that even the entity's servants rarely ventured there. Running Bear found it during his systematic exploration of the town's forgotten spaces, guided by the obsidian mirror's visions and his growing understanding of the cliff-carved structure's hidden architecture. The helmet was different from any Spanish armor he had seen in museums or battlefields. The metal was black as midnight, but not from age or tarnish. This darkness seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and symbols were etched into its surface, the same writhing patterns that decorated the iron shackles and appeared in the entity's deepest chambers. When Running Bear lifted the helmet, images flooded his mind with such intensity that he nearly dropped it. Memories that weren't his own, experiences filtered through centuries of supernatural corruption, but underneath the distortion lay fragments of truth that made his blood run cold. Diego Mendoza, kneeling in a chamber carved from living rock, signing a contract written in languages that predated human speech. The Spanish expedition, lost and dying in the wilderness, desperate enough to bargain with something they couldn't understand. And the ritual that bound the entity to this reality, performed with ingredients that included the conquistador's own blood and the promise of endless servitude. But the helmet held other memories as well. The face of the man who had worn it, Captain Francisco de Morales, Mendoza's second-in-command, and the only expedition member who had understood the true cost of their bargain. De Morales had tried to prevent the ritual, had fought against his superior's decision to trade their souls for immortality. He had failed, but not before hiding something in the deepest chambers of the developing town. Something the entity needed, but couldn't safely retrieve without risking the entire binding that kept it anchored to this reality. The original contract. Running Bear carried the helmet back to his chamber, moving through corridors that felt different now that he understood their true purpose. The town wasn't just a prison, it was a ritual space, every stone positioned according to supernatural geometry that maintained the entity's grip on this dimension. The Spanish had built a perfect trap, but they had also built the key to unlock it. Maria found him 3 days later, studying the helmet's markings with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She had grown accustomed to his periods of focused concentration, but this felt different, more dangerous. "You look like a man who's seen his own death," she said, settling beside him with the careful movements that had become second nature after decades of captivity. "Not my death, everyone." Running Bear traced one of the symbols with his finger, feeling how it seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. "The entity isn't immortal. It's sustained by the binding ritual, fed by our despair, but it can be killed." The Spanish knew this when they made their bargain. Then why didn't they build in a way to escape? Because they believed they were getting the better end of the deal. Eternal life in exchange for serving as bait for travelers and lost souls. They thought they could control what they had summoned. Running Bear's laugh carried no humor. They were wrong about everything except the binding itself. That part of the ritual was solid. The helmet's memories had shown him the location of the original contract, hidden in a chamber behind the altar where the entity's deepest manifestations took physical form. The document contained not just the terms of the bargain, but the specific conditions under which it could be dissolved. De Morales left instructions, he continued, hidden in the helmet's construction, encoded in symbols that look like decoration, but are actually a map and a warning. The binding can be broken, but only during the celestial alignment, when the barriers between dimensions grow thin. The dark door. 5 years from now. Yes, but breaking the binding requires more than just timing. It needs a willing sacrifice from among the entity's servants, someone who has been marked by its attention but retains enough humanity to choose death over continued service. Maria's face went pale as she understood the implications. The blood, it's been marking you for 13 years, preparing you to serve as the sacrifice that could free everyone else, or consume me completely if I'm not strong enough to turn the ritual against it. Running Bear set the helmet aside, its weight suddenly too much to bear. G. Moralia's tried to be that sacrifice. The helmet holds his final memories, dying alone in the deep chambers, while the entity fed on his life force and his failure. The knowledge sat between them like a poisonous thing, beautiful in its clarity but terrible in its implications. After 13 years of patient resistance, Running Bear had finally found the key to their prison. But using it would require him to walk willingly into the entity's deepest chambers and trust that his Apache spiritual training was stronger than 400 years of accumulated hunger. "There's more," he said quietly. "The ritual requires cooperation from the original bloodlines, descendants of the Spanish who signed the first contract. Elena Mendoza could serve that function, but she would have to choose to betray everything her family has served for centuries. She gave you the bloodstone. Maybe part of her is already ready to choose." Running Bear hoped so, because, without Elena's participation, all his knowledge was useless. The entity had protected itself well, requiring its own servants to participate in their liberation. It was a perfect trap, designed by minds that understood human nature all too well, but it was still a trap, and traps could be turned against those who set them. Running Bear had spent 13 years learning to think like his enemy. Now he would discover whether that knowledge was enough to destroy something that had been feeding on human souls since before his people's oldest stories were first told around winter fires. The priest's testament was written in Latin mixed with Spanish, the ink faded to brown but still legible after centuries of careful preservation. Running Bear found it exactly where the conquistador's helmet had indicated, sealed behind a false wall in the chamber where the entity manifested its deepest hungers. The document was wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked inside a silver box that bore the seal of the Franciscan order. Father Miguel Santos had been the expedition's chaplain, tasked with blessing their venture and ensuring the conquistadors' souls remained pure during their quest for gold. Instead, he had become the unwilling architect of their damnation, forced to perform a ritual that violated every principle of his faith. His final confession, written in the hours before his death, laid out the binding ceremony in meticulous detail. But more importantly, it revealed the fatal flaw that Santos had deliberately woven into the ritual's foundation, a weakness so subtle that even the entity hadn't detected it in 4 centuries of feeding. The binding requires willing listen from the bound. Running Bear read aloud, translating the Latin for Maria's benefit. But true willingness cannot be coerced, purchased or sustained indefinitely. Should the servants ever act in genuine unity against their master's interests, the contract becomes void. Maria leaned closer, studying the faded text. Unity. How many servants would that require? Santos doesn't specify numbers, but he mentions that the entity has grown dependent on its servants' cooperation to maintain its anchor in this reality. If enough of them withdrew their consent simultaneously, the binding would collapse. Maria's voice carried a mixture of hope and terror. But the servants have been conditioned for centuries. Most of them don't even remember they have a choice. Running Bear continued reading, finding passages that made his heart race with possibility. Santos had been more clever than anyone realized. The priest had accepted his role in creating the binding, but he had also ensured it contained the seeds of its own destruction. "Listen to this," he said, pointing to a section written in Spanish. "The master believes it controls through fear and hunger, but both emotions require memory to sustain them. Servants who truly forget their former lives lose the capacity for the despair that feeds the binding. They become empty vessels, useless for the ritual's continuation. That's why the entity preserves fragments of its servants' humanity," Maria realized. "It needs them to remember enough of their old lives to feel loss, but not so much that they rebel. Exactly. But Santos found a way to exploit that balance. The binding requires the servants to choose their enslavement repeatedly, every moment of every day. It's not a single decision made centuries ago. It's an ongoing contract that must be renewed constantly through their actions and compliance. The testament revealed other crucial details. The entity was not native to this dimension, but had been summoned from a realm where different laws governed reality. The binding ritual created a bridge between worlds, allowing the creature to exist in human reality by anchoring itself to willing human soul. But that bridge worked both ways. If the anchor points were severed simultaneously, the entity would be pulled back to its origin dimension with tremendous force. The celestial alignment weakens the dimensional barriers. Running Bear continued. During those windows, the entity must focus most of its energy on maintaining its grip on this reality. That's when it's most vulnerable to coordinated resistance. 4 years, Maria whispered. We have 4 years to convince enough servants to remember who they were before this place claimed them. But the testament contained warnings as well. Previous attempts at mass rebellion had failed because the organizers had misunderstood the nature of the entity's hold over its servant. Simple revolt wasn't enough. The servants had to genuinely choose freedom over the security of their eternal bondage. They had to want liberation more than they feared the unknown consequences of destroying the only reality they had known for centuries. Santos tried to build that choice into Elena Mendoza's family line. Running Bear discovered in the document's final pages. He blessed her ancestor with the ability to see through the entity's deceptions, hoping that someday a descendant would be strong enough to lead the other servants to freedom. That's why she gave you the bloodstone. She's been waiting for someone who could understand Santos's message. Running Bear folded the testament carefully, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on him. The priest had died believing his plan would eventually succeed, but he couldn't have anticipated how thoroughly the entity would condition its servants over 400 years of gradual psychological erosion. We need to change our approach completely. He stopped trying to organize secret resistance and start helping people remember who they used to be. Not as a form of rebellion, but as a return to their authentic selves. How do we do that without alerting the entity? By working with its nature instead of against it. The creature feeds on despair and false hope, but it struggles to digest genuine joy, authentic connection, and memories of love that existed before its influence. Running Bear touched the sacred eagle feather at his chest, feeling it pulse with renewed purpose. We're going to teach the servants how to remember what it feels like to be human. The approach would be more subtle than anything they had attempted before, requiring patience and wisdom rather than courage and cunning. But Santos's testament had shown him something crucial. The entity's greatest strength was also its most critical weakness. It needed human servants who retained just enough humanity to suffer meaningfully, but that same humanity contained the power to choose freedom over security, love over fear, and authentic existence over the comfortable emptiness of eternal bondage. The Unity Feather Bundle grew one plume at a time, each edition representing another soul who had begun to remember what freedom felt like. Running Bear crafted it according to traditions his grandmother had taught him, but adapted for circumstances she could never have imagined. Instead of feathers from a single tribe's sacred birds, this bundle contained plumes from every nation and culture represented among the town's prisoners. Elena Mendoza contributed the first feather, a black quill from a raven that had somehow survived in the cursed canyon, feeding on scraps but never losing its wild nature. When she pressed it into Running Bear's hands during a seemingly casual encounter in the town's central square, her eyes held awareness that hadn't been there in decades. "I remember my grandmother's stories," she whispered, so quietly that only Apache-trained ears could catch the words. "Before the hunger, before the binding. She used to sing while she baked bread, and the whole house smelled like cinnamon and joy. It was a small memory, but authentic in ways the entity couldn't duplicate or consume." Elena had found something in her past that predated the town's influence, a fragment of genuine human experience that existed independent of supernatural manipulation. Thomas contributed the second feather white down from a dove that had nested in the abandoned Spanish mission before the entity's servants claimed it. "I remember trading posts," he told Running Bear, while they worked together, maintaining the water system. The sound of silver coins on wooden counters, the smell of coffee beans roasting over wood fires, the way sunset looked through clean glass windows. Each memory shared was a small act of rebellion, not against the entity's rules, but against the psychological conditioning that made its prisoners forget they had ever been anything other than servants. Running Bear taught them techniques for protecting these recovered fragments, ways to keep authentic experiences separate from the false memories the creature used to maintain control. Sarah, the baker whose children had died centuries ago, offered a feather from a meadowlark she claimed had sung outside her original home in Ohio. "I remember kneading dough," she said, tears running down cheeks that hadn't wept in decades. "My hands covered in flour, sunlight streaming through kitchen windows, my children laughing in the next room. They were real. They lived. They mattered." The bundle grew slowly, carefully, with each addition representing not just another ally, but another recovered piece of authentic humanity. A blue jay feather from Marcus, who had been a schoolteacher before his capture and was beginning to remember the joy of watching children learn to read. A cardinal feather from Catherine, who recalled the sound of church bells in her Pennsylvania village. Most importantly, the bundle included feathers from some of the Spanish servants who had served the entity for centuries. These ancient souls had almost forgotten they possessed the capacity for choice, but Running Bear's patient work was helping them rediscover fragments of the men and women they had been before the binding claimed them. "The creature notices the change," Maria warned during one of their increasingly open meetings. The resistance network no longer needed to communicate through bone whistles and coded messaging. The entity seemed to interpret their growing connections as evidence of successful integration into the community. "It notices happiness," Running Bear corrected, "but it interprets authentic joy as a sign of successful condition. The creature has fed on artificial emotions for so long that it's forgotten what genuine human feeling looks like." This was the key insight Father Santos had hidden in his testament. The entity could consume despair, fear, and false hope with perfect efficiency. But authentic human emotions, real love, genuine joy, true courage, were difficult for it to digest. They provided less nourishment and sometimes caused what could only be described as spiritual indigestion. "We're not building a resistance," Running Bear explained to the growing circle of awakened prisoners. "We're rebuilding ourselves, becoming human again in ways the creature can't understand or control." The Unity feather bundle hung in his chamber like a small prayer made visible, each plume representing not just another ally, but another victory over the entity's psychological conditioning. When the wind blew through his window, the feathers danced with their own life, singing songs in languages that predated the binding. Elena Mendoza visited him more frequently now, no longer hiding her awareness behind the mask of mechanical compliance. During their conversations, she shared fragments of the knowledge passed down through her family's bloodline, secrets Father Santos had embedded in the Mendoza family's oral traditions. "The alignment comes in 3 years," she said during one such visit. "My grandmother taught me to watch for specific star configurations to prepare for the night when the barriers grow thin. But Santos's blessing comes with a price." "What price?" "The descendant who chooses to break the binding must be prepared to anchor the ritual with their own life force. The entity won't release its hold willingly, and someone must provide the spiritual energy needed to sever connections that have existed for centuries." Running Bear touched the Unity feather bundle, feeling how each plume pulsed with the recovered humanity of its contributor. "Santos believed one person's sacrifice could free everyone." "Not one person's death," Elena clarified. "One person's complete surrender of self-interest, someone willing to choose the community's freedom over their own survival, not as a gesture of despair, but as an act of perfect love." The distinction was crucial. The entity fed on death, but it struggled to consume selfless love that sought nothing in return. Such sacrifice was antithetical to the hunger that drove the creature's existence. The star chart was carved into a piece of obsidian larger than any running bear had ever seen, its surface polished to mirror brightness, and marked with constellations that seemed to move when viewed from different angles. Elena Mendoza led him to it, through passages he hadn't known existed, deeper into the cliff face than even the entity's manifestation chambers. Father Santos created this before his death, she explained, her voice echoing strangely in the carved stone corridor. He studied the celestial mechanics that govern the dimensional barriers, learning how the Spanish had calculated the timing for their original ritual. The chamber where they found the star chart was different from the rest of the town's architecture. Instead of the cramped, claustrophobic spaces that characterized most of the cliff-carved structure, this room opened into a natural cavern, large enough to hold a small cathedral. Phosphorescent minerals in the walls provided gentle illumination, and the air felt cleaner somehow, less oppressed by the entity's supernatural presence. The obsidian chart occupied the chamber's center, mounted on a stone pedestal that allowed viewers to walk around it and study the markings from every angle. The constellations mapped across its surface told a story that spanned centuries past alignments marked with silver inlay, future configurations predicted in gold. The dark door opens when 5 specific stars align with the canyon's orientation, Elena said, pointing to markings that showed how celestial mechanics intersected with the town's geographical position. It happens every 20 years, but the strength of the alignment varies depending on other factors. Running Bear studied the chart, noting how some alignments were marked with symbols indicating greater or lesser dimensional instability. The approaching alignment was marked with the strongest symbol Santos had used, a configuration that would make the barriers between worlds paper-thin for exactly 3 hours. This is when the entity will be most vulnerable, he realized, but also when its desperation will make it most dangerous. The chart showed other details that made his pulse quicken. During the strongest alignments, the entity's control over its servants weakened dramatically. The supernatural conditioning that kept them obedient would fluctuate, creating windows of opportunity for coordinated resistance. But those same fluctuations would also allow the creature to access powers it normally kept restrained. Santos calculated that we would need at least 60% of the servants to withdraw their consent simultaneously, Elena continued. Fewer than that, and the entity can simply consume the rebels to strengthen its hold over the remainder. 60%. Running Bear counted the awakened souls in his mind. Elena, Maria, Thomas, Sarah, and perhaps 30 others who had begun to remember their authentic selves. Against nearly 200 total servants, it seemed an impossible goal. How many servants retain enough humanity to make a genuine choice? He asked. More than you might think. The entity has been careless in recent decades, growing complacent after centuries of easy feeding. Many of its oldest servants have been allowed to drift into a kind of half-sleep, where they follow routines without truly engaging with their circumstances. Elena led him to another section of the chart, where Santos had mapped not just celestial mechanics, but the psychological landscape of the bound community. The priest had understood that breaking the binding would require more than proper timing. It would need a critical mass of authentic human choice exercised simultaneously. The servants fall into 3 categories, she explained. Those who have been completely consumed and no longer possess the capacity for independent thought. Those who retain enough humanity to choose but have become addicted to the security of eternal bondage. And those who could choose freedom if they remembered it was possible. The chart indicated that roughly 40% of the servants fell into the first category, lost beyond recovery. Another 30% were psychologically dependent on their captivity, preferring familiar misery to uncertain liberation. But the remaining 30% could potentially be reached if approached correctly. Santos believed the key was demonstration rather than persuasion. Elena said, "Show people what authentic humanity looks like, and some will remember they once possessed it themselves." This aligned perfectly with Running Bear's own observations. The awakened prisoners weren't converting others through argument or rebellion, but through example. Their recovered joy, their authentic connections with each other, their growing sense of purpose, beyond mere survival. These qualities attracted attention from servants who had forgotten such things were possible. The alignment is 14 months away, Elena continued, showing him Santos's calculations. We have that long to awaken enough souls to reach the 60% threshold. Running Bear studied the star chart's projections, noting how the priest had accounted for variables that went far beyond simple astronomical mechanics. The entities' feeding cycles, the psychological resilience of different servant populations, even the seasonal changes that affected the canyon's spiritual atmosphere. Santos had considered everything in his desperate gamble to create an opportunity for freedom. He died believing this plan would work. Elena said softly, "His faith is what protects this chamber from the entity's detection. But faith alone won't be enough when the moment comes. What else do we need?" Elena pointed to a final section of the star chart, where Santos had outlined the specific ritual that would sever the binding. Someone who has been marked by the entity's attention, but never fully claimed by it. Someone whose spirit burns with traditions older than the binding itself. Someone willing to channel 400 years of accumulated resistance into a single moment of perfect choice. The bloodstone pulsed against Running Bear's chest, its rhythm synchronized with the phosphorescent glow from the chamber wall. He had been marked, prepared, and tested for nearly 2 decades. Now he understood why. The sacrifice blade was older than the Spanish binding, older than the conquistador's desperate bargain, older perhaps than human memory itself. Elena found it in the deepest chamber beneath the town, wrapped in cloth that crumbled to dust at her touch, and lying beside an altar that predated any architecture Running Bear had seen in the cliff-carved structure. Santos didn't create the original binding, she explained, as they examined the ancient weapon by the light of phosphorescent minerals. He adapted something that was already here, something the indigenous people of this canyon had used to contain threats from other dimensions. The blade was carved from a single piece of obsidian so pure it seemed to contain its own darkness. Unlike the mirror that showed visions of truth, this obsidian absorbed light and reflection alike, creating an edge that appeared to cut through reality itself. Symbols covered its surface, not Spanish or Apache markings, but something that predated both cultures by millennia. The people who made this understood that some hungers are too vast to destroy. Elena continued. They could only be contained, redirected, or sent back to the dimensions where they belonged. Running Bear lifted the blade carefully, feeling how it seemed to vibrate with contained power. The obsidian was warm despite the chamber's chill, and touching it sent visions racing through his mind. Images of ancient peoples performing rituals under stars that no longer existed, binding entities that should never have been allowed to cross dimensional barriers. The Spanish found this place because the original containment was already failing, Elena said. The indigenous rituals required renewal every few generations, but the people who knew the proper ceremonies had been scattered or killed by disease and warfare. Santos tried to adapt their methods using Christian theology, but he was working with incomplete knowledge. The visions showed Running Bear fragments of the original binding, a ritual that required willing sacrifice not to feed the entity, but to strengthen the barriers that kept it in prison. The ancient peoples had understood that some prices were worth paying to protect future generations from hungers that consumed entire realities. Santos's adaptation worked, but imperfectly, Elena explained. Instead of containing the entity, it gave it a foothold in this dimension, while providing enough nourishment to keep it satisfied. The binding became a feeding mechanism rather than a prison, but the sacrifice blade retained memory of its original purpose. When Running Bear held it during his evening meditations, he could feel the accumulated intentions of countless generations who had wielded it to protect their people from supernatural threats. The weapon wasn't designed to kill in any conventional sense. It was meant to sever connections between dimensions, to cut through the spiritual bonds that allowed entities like the hunger to maintain their grip on human reality. The ritual Santos designed requires the blade to cut through more than just dimensional barriers, Elena said. It must sever the entity's connection to every servant simultaneously, while providing enough spiritual energy to send the creature back to its origin dimension. Energy that comes from the person wielding the blade.
Yes.
But not their death, their complete surrender of attachment to individual existence. The blade feeds on selfless love, on the kind of sacrifice that seeks nothing for itself but offers everything for others. Running Bear understood. The ancient peoples had designed their rituals around principles that directly opposed the entity's nature. Where the creature fed on selfishness, fear, and despair, the containment ceremonies drew power from selflessness, courage, and hope. The sacrifice blade was a focusing tool that amplified those qualities until they became potent enough to wound something that existed partially outside physical reality. "How many people have used this blade?" he asked. Santos was the last. Before him, perhaps dozens over the centuries. Each one chose to anchor a ritual that protected their people from threats they couldn't defeat through conventional means. The blade's visions showed him glimpses of those previous wielders, medicine workers, and spiritual leaders who had faced impossible odds with nothing but their willingness to sacrifice everything for their community's survival. Some had succeeded in their mission, others had failed, but weakened the threats enough for future generations to finish what they started. "The blade requires a specific state of consciousness," Elena continued. "Perfect clarity about the choice being made, complete acceptance of the consequences, and absolute love for those being protected. Any trace of self-interest, fear, or doubt will cause the ritual to fail." Running Bear spent the remaining months before the alignment learning to achieve that state of consciousness through intensive meditation and spiritual preparation. The sacred eagle feather guided him through practices his grandmother had only hinted at, techniques for surrendering individual identity while maintaining the core of purpose that would drive the ritual. The Unity Feather bundle grew to include plumes from nearly 80 awakened souls, more than the 60% threshold Santos had calculated as necessary. But numbers alone wouldn't be enough. Each person would have to choose simultaneously, exercising their authentic will at the precise moment when the dimensional barriers were thinnest. "The entity knows something is changing," Maria warned during their final planning sessions. "It's growing more aggressive, more desperate. I think it senses the approach of the alignment." Running Bear nodded, feeling the bloodstone's rhythm becoming more erratic as the celestial configuration approached. The creature was indeed preparing for something, gathering its strength for a confrontation it couldn't quite understand, but instinctively feared. "Let it prepare," he said, touching the sacrifice blade where it rested against his chest beside the sacred feather. "We're ready for whatever comes." The Liberation Bell had hung silent in the mission tower for 4 centuries, its bronze surface green with age and marked with symbols that seemed to shift between Spanish Christian iconography and something far older. When the dimensional barriers began to thin on the night of the alignment, the bell started to resonate with harmonics that no human hand could produce. Running Bear felt the change before he heard it, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the canyon walls themselves as the 5 crucial stars moved into their prophesied configuration. The bloodstone against his chest grew warm, then hot, then blazing with supernatural fire that should have burned but instead filled him with purpose clearer than mountain air. Throughout the town, awakened souls felt the same resonance. Elena Mendoza stood in the mission's sanctuary, holding Father Santos's original ritual notes as the ancient words began to glow with phosphorescent light. Maria gathered with Thomas and Sarah in the central courtyard, where the Unity Feather bundle hung from a pole planted in soil that had been sanctified with 20 years of patient hope. The entity stirred in its deep chambers like a vast beast sensing the approach of hunters. Its servants throughout the town began moving with the jerky, unnatural precision that marked times of supernatural crisis. But among them, 80 souls moved with different purpose. Not the mechanical obedience of long conditioning, but the deliberate steps of people who had remembered how to choose. "Now," Elena whispered, her voice carrying somehow to every awakened soul despite the distance between them. The word triggered responses prepared through months of careful coordination. Doors opened throughout the town as people stepped out of buildings where they had lived as prisoners and into streets where they would stand as free humans. The keeper appeared in the courtyard with movements too quick to track, his pale features twisted with confusion and growing rage. "What is this?" he demanded, but his voice carried none of its usual authority. The dimensional instability was affecting him as well. disrupting the supernatural conditioning that had made him the entity's perfect servant for 4 centuries. "This is choice," Running Bear answered, stepping forward with the sacrifice blade gleaming in his hand. Around him, the awakened souls formed a circle that encompassed the entire central area of the town. Each person held something that connected them to their authentic identity, a memory made physical, a token of the life they had lived before the binding claimed them. The entity's roar echoed from the deep chambers, a sound that existed in frequencies beyond human hearing, but resonated through bone and spirit. It was the cry of something that had never experienced genuine resistance, that had fed unchallenged for centuries on the despair of trapped souls. Now, for the first time, it faced prey that refused to remain helpless. Power surged through the town's stone structures as the creature fought to maintain its hold over servants who were actively withdrawing their consent. Cracks appeared in walls that had stood for centuries. Phosphorescent minerals in the canyon walls flared with blinding light. The very air seemed to thicken with supernatural pressure as reality bent under the strain of conflicting forces. "You cannot escape," the keeper snarled, but his words carried the hollow ring of desperation. "The binding is eternal. You belong to us." "No," Maria said simply. "We belong to ourselves." One by one, the awakened souls spoke their names, not the identities the entity had assigned them during their captivity, but the names they had carried before entering this cursed place. Each declaration was an act of rebellion against centuries of conditioning, a refusal to accept the fiction that they had ever truly belonged to the hungry darkness. The liberation bell's resonance grew stronger as the stars reached perfect alignment overhead. Running Bear felt the sacrifice blade pulse in his hand, its ancient obsidian edge beginning to cut through more than just physical matter. The weapon was responding to the spiritual energy of 80 souls choosing freedom simultaneously, channeling their collective will into something sharp enough to sever dimensional bonds. But the entity wasn't finished. Power exploded from the deep chambers as the creature abandoned all pretense of subtlety, manifesting in forms that hurt to perceive directly. Tentacles of living shadow erupted from the ground between buildings. The air filled with whispers in languages that predated human speech. Reality itself began to fray at the edges as the hungry darkness fought to prevent its prey from escaping. "Hold your positions," Running Bear called to the others, raising the sacrifice blade toward the star-crowded sky. "Remember who you are. Remember why we're doing this." Around the circle, awakened souls stood firm despite the supernatural assault. They had spent months preparing for this moment, learning to maintain their authentic selves in the face of overwhelming fear and confusion. The entity's attacks found little purchase on spirits that had already chosen to value truth over comfort, freedom over security. The blade began to sing, a sound like wind through eagle feathers, like water over sacred stones, like all the voices of his ancestors joining in a song of resistance that had been building for 20 years. Running Bear felt his individual consciousness beginning to expand, merging with the collective will of everyone who had ever refused to surrender their humanity to supernatural hunger. The liberation bell's bronze surface cracked as harmonics beyond its physical capacity to contain poured through the mission tower. Its 4-century silence was ending in a peal that would either announce freedom or mark the final failure of hope. The memory stone formed in Running Bear's hand as the sacrifice blade completed its work, crystallizing from the very air as 20 years of accumulated experience compressed into a single perfect artifact. The crystal was clear as mountain water, but shot through with veins of silver that pulsed with their own inner light. When he looked into its depths, he could see everything, every moment of captivity, every small victory of the resistance, every soul who had chosen freedom over the comfortable slavery of eternal bondage. The world outside the canyon had changed beyond recognition. Where Running Bear remembered scattered settlements and territorial conflicts, he now found railroad tracks stretching across landscapes that had been wilderness when he entered the hidden town. Telegraph wires connected distant cities with messages that traveled faster than horses could run. The very air tasted different, tinged with smoke from industries that had been born while he languished in supernatural captivity. But the greatest shock was seeing his own reflection in the waters of the stream, where he had first picked up the trail of stolen horses. The face that looked back at him belonged to a stranger, aged not just by time, but by experiences that had marked him in ways the physical world could barely comprehend. His hair had gone completely white, though he remembered it as black as raven wing. His eyes held depths that spoke of visions no mortal mind should have been forced to witness. Most disturbing of all, symbols were etched into his skin, the same writhing patterns that had decorated the iron shackles and the sacrifice blade. They covered his arms and chest like tattoos, but they moved with their own subtle life, shifting and flowing in response to emotions he couldn't quite name. The entity's attention had marked him permanently, leaving traces that would never completely fade. The other survivors bore similar changes, though none as extensive as his own. Maria's hair had turned silver, and her eyes held flecks of the same phosphorescent glow that had lit the cursed town's walls. Elena Mendoza moved with a fluid grace that suggested her bones had learned different laws of motion during her centuries of captivity. Even Thomas and Sarah showed signs of their supernatural ordeal, shadows that fell at wrong angles, voices that carried harmonics no human throat should produce. They were changed, all of them, marked by their contact with forces that existed outside normal reality. But they were free, and that freedom had cost them pieces of themselves they could never recover. The first settlement they encountered was a railroad town that hadn't existed when Running Bear began his pursuit of stolen horses. The citizens stared at the group of survivors with a mixture of fear and fascination, recognizing something otherworldly in their appearance, but unable to identify exactly what they were seeing. Apache, one of the townspeople whispered, pointing at Running Bear's distinctive features, but the word carried uncertainty, as if the speaker couldn't quite believe what their eyes were telling them. Running Bear understood their confusion. He was at the teeth, but he was also something else now, something that belonged partially to the world of spirits and shadows, marked by contact with hungers that most humans couldn't imagine. The memory stone pulsed against his palm, its silver veins recording even this moment of recognition and loss. Finding his people proved more difficult than he had anticipated. The Apache bands he remembered had been scattered by 20 years of warfare and forced relocation. Many had been moved to reservations, hundreds of miles from their traditional territories. Others had been absorbed into Mexican communities or disappeared entirely into the vast anonymity of an American frontier that no longer welcomed indigenous peoples. When he finally located his surviving relatives, they barely recognized him. His nephew Joseph, who had been a child when Running Bear disappeared, was now a middle-aged man working as a scout for the U.S. Army. The reunion was awkward, strained by the gulf of experiences that couldn't be explained or shared. "We held a death ceremony for you," Joseph said during their first conversation. "After 5 years with no word, we assumed the Comanche had killed you or that you died in the desert chasing those horses." Running Bear nodded, understanding that in many ways they had been correct. The man who had entered the hidden canyon was dead, replaced by something that carried his memories but bore the permanent scars of supernatural contact. The memory stone showed him fragments of the life he might have lived, children who could have been born, hunts he could have led, stories he could have told around winter fires. But it also showed him the alternative, a timeline where the entity's influence had eventually spread beyond the hidden canyon, consuming other settlements and growing stronger with each feeding. His sacrifice had prevented that future, but the cost was isolation from the very people he had sought to protect. "What happened to you out there?" Joseph asked, studying the moving symbols on Running Bear's arms with barely concealed unease. "I learned that some battles can only be won by those willing to pay prices that others can't understand." Running Bear answered, closing his fingers around the memory stone. "And I learned that freedom sometimes costs more than slavery, but it's still worth the price. The Guardian's staff was forged in the ruins of the hidden town, crafted from materials that existed nowhere else in the natural world. Running Bear made it himself during the long winter following his return, working with obsidian that still held traces of dimensional instability and iron that remembered the weight of supernatural bondage. The staff was both weapon and warning, beautiful enough to attract attention, but disturbing enough to make observers understand they were seeing something beyond ordinary craftsmanship. The symbols carved into its surface matched those that marked Running Bear's skin patterns that shifted and flowed with their own subtle life, responding to the presence of otherworldly threats. When he carried the staff through settlements and trading posts, sensitive individuals felt its power like a cold wind, recognizing something that spoke to the deepest parts of human intuition about danger and protection. 23 years had passed since Running Bear's emergence from the cursed canyon. He had aged during those decades, but not in normal ways. The supernatural forces that had marked him seemed to preserve his body while allowing his spirit to accumulate wisdom that belonged to someone far older. His hair remained white as winter snow, but his movements retained the fluid strength of a warrior in his prime. He had become something new in the world, a guardian who walked between the realm of everyday human concerns and the darker spaces where entities like the hungry shadow waited for opportunities to feed. The memory stone, now set into the Guardian's staff like a crystal eye, showed him visions of threats that were stirring in response to the changing world. Railroads and telegraph lines were connecting previously isolated places, creating pathways that supernatural predators could follow to reach populations that had once been protected by distance and ignorance. Gold rushes and land disputes were disturbing sights that indigenous peoples had marked as dangerous, releasing things that had been contained by careful ceremonies maintained for generations. Most concerning of all, Running Bear saw signs that the entity's influence hadn't been completely destroyed. The binding was broken, the town abandoned, but fragments of the creature's hunger had attached themselves to objects and places, waiting for the right conditions to reform into something threatening. The liberation had been successful, but it wasn't permanent. "You've created a network," Maria observed during one of her visits to the small cabin where Running Bear made his base. She was one of the few survivors who stayed in regular contact, using skills learned during their captivity to help identify and contain supernatural threats that emerged across the territories, not created, inherited. Running Bear corrected, gesturing toward maps that covered the cabin's walls. Indigenous peoples have always maintained guardians who watch for these kinds of dangers. The hidden town was just one threat among many that our people have been managing for centuries. The maps showed a web of sacred sites, ceremonial grounds and danger zones that stretched across the continent. Each location was marked with symbols that indicated the type of supernatural activity present and the methods needed to contain it. Some areas required regular rituals to maintain protective barriers. Others needed to be avoided entirely during certain times of year. A few had been compromised by white settlement and required active intervention to prevent disasters. Running Bear had become the coordinator for this ancient network, using his unique experience with dimensional entities to help traditional guardians deal with threats that were becoming more aggressive as the world changed around them. The Guardian's staff was both his badge of office and his primary tool, capable of detecting supernatural influence and channeling protective energies when needed. "The work never ends," he told Elena Mendoza during one of their meetings at a remote mission that served as a way station for people dealing with otherworldly problems. She had chosen to remain in the church, using her family's inherited knowledge to help priests and ministers recognize when their congregations were being influenced by forces beyond normal understanding. "Santa's always said that the price of spiritual safety was eternal vigilance," Elena replied, her own hair now silver with decades of service. "We freed ourselves from one prison, but we accepted responsibility for preventing others from falling into similar traps." The Guardian's staff pulsed with warm light as Running Bear considered the weight of that responsibility. Every supernatural threat they contained, every entity they banished, every protective ritual they maintained, was a small victory in an ongoing war that most people didn't even know was being fought. But it was necessary work, and Running Bear had found a peace in it that his younger self could never have understood. The Apache warrior who had entered the hidden canyon seeking stolen horses was gone, replaced by something larger and more patient. He had learned that true strength came not from winning individual battles, but from accepting responsibility for protecting others from dangers they couldn't comprehend. As evening settled over the remote landscape, Running Bear shouldered the Guardian's staff and began the walk toward his next assignment. Somewhere in the growing darkness, threats were stirring that would require his attention. The hidden town was gone, but its lesson remained. Some hungers could only be contained by those willing to sacrifice everything to protect the innocent. He carried that knowledge with him like a sacred fire, ensuring that the darkness would never again find such easy prey among his people.